Welcome to the For Fresno podcast. My name is Gordon, and for those who are new to For Fresno, this is a podcast about what the church is for, not what the church is against. I think many people think about the church and they think about what they are against. What are the do's and don'ts and the legalism that come with religion? But this is about what people are for, and we're for many things to help our community grow. And so this first episode, I interview Pastor Joe White of Neighborhood Church in the Jackson neighborhood. And what he's doing there is amazing. Him and his wife Heidi have created a nonprofit, they've created small businesses, and they are trying to impact a direct neighborhood and community for the better of Fresno. In fact, one of the things that they're most passionate about is mobilizing people to simply obey Jesus' commandment of loving their neighbor. And I just want to say one disclaimer. Before we start this podcast, we had some technical difficulties on both sides. Joe lives in the Jackson area, which he'll soon describe in this conversation is an area with low income and one of the lower poverty areas in Fresno. And his Wi-Fi kept glitching and also was slow and then fast at times. So you'll hear him kind of speed up his conversation and then slow down. That's not how Joe talks. That is purely the internet interpreting what he's saying to my recording software. And then for me, my camera fell asleep for some reason halfway through the conversation. So you will then see a black screen from me about 10 minutes in. So I apologize for that. But here we go. First episode. You're going to have some kinks. All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump in to this wonderful conversation I had with Pastor Joe White from Neighborhood Church. Hey everyone, welcome to the For Fresno podcast. My name is Gordon, and today I get to interview a special friend, someone that I've grown with slowly over the past couple of years, just talking off and on about ministry, about neighborhood ministry, and that is Pastor Joe White. Pastor Joe, welcome to the show.
Absolutely love being here.
Well, I'm so excited to hear your story and share it with our listeners out there. And just for the listeners out there, I met Joe a couple years ago in Loving Our Neighbor cohort through ESA. And we just have this passion to talk about how do we reach our community? How do we reach our immediate neighborhood? And so often the communities around us get overlooked while we send people overseas, which still is a good thing. But in the church world, as we're looking to influence people for Christ and impact our cities, right here in our neighborhood is often one of the best spots. And so Pastor Joe, he oversees Neighborhood Church in the Jacksonville neighborhood. He also oversees the Jackson Community Develop Corporation and Neighborhood Jobs. And so Joe, tell us a little bit about what all these fires you got going and how you look to impact the city.
Well, the Jackson neighborhood is kind of an amazing place. So we're in Southeast Fresno, and if you can imagine, First to Cedar to Larry to Ventura. And it's like a square mile. And we see our neighborhood almost like a geographical area of spiritual responsibility. So whether the issues are economic, political, spiritual, relational, whatever, we just invest ourselves into those issues because we live there. We're residents there. I live in the Jackson neighborhood. And our entire team lives in the Jackson neighborhood. So for us, it's a beautiful place to express the gospel, saying, look, what if we were a church? What if we were a movement that was about connecting people to Jesus, about serving actual neighbors' practical needs, and then building a neighborhood that looked more like heaven? In other words, if God got his way on 8 blocks by 12 blocks, what would it look like? What would the trees look like? What would the streets look like? What would the alleys look like? And we just have this imagination for creating a place that reflects the values of heaven, and that's our obsession.
Yeah, and that is so inspiring because oftentimes, like I was saying, we forget about what's around us, but what around us is people who share our same standard of living, people who share our same values. Our kids go to the same school, and you're totally investing in all of that, and that's just really encouraging. And honestly, it's a little bit of a mind shift because how many people do you know that don't know their neighbors?
Oh yeah, tons. I mean, it's the craziest thing. Jesus says, love your neighbors. And what we do when we hear that as Christians, we go, okay, that means the people at the gym. That means the people in my workplace. That means the people I come in contact with at the supermarket. And we have a definition for who those neighbors are. Everybody except our actual neighbors. You know, the 8 people who live around you, the 3 across the street, the 3 behind you, the one that lives here and the one that lives here. Those are my 8 neighbors. Do I invest in them with the same passion and at the same intensity that I love God with? Because that's what Jesus said. He said, love me with everything that you got, intensely, heart, soul, mind, strength. And likewise, the second greatest commandment is love your neighbors.
Right.
Do I actually do that? And that question keeps me up at night.
Right. Yeah. And that's so convicting because it's hard to love people who are just as flawed as us. And especially when someone cuts us off or a kid's playing in our lawn. I mean, not really, but like, those examples where people are stepping on our toes in our neighborhood and we have to love them just the same. Sure. And so I want to
the most neglected, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's most neglected commandment in Scripture. Think about this, Gordon.
Yeah.
Fresno and Clovis in the last census tract said that between Fresno and Clovis, there's an estimated 100,000 Christians who self-identified in the last census tract calling themselves Christians.
Okay. Yeah.
The combined population of Fresno and Clovis is about 600,000, about 500,000 in Fresno, about 100,000 in Clovis, 600,000. Theoretically, for every 6 people in Fresno and Clovis, there's somebody that said on a census tract data that they're a Christian. If we got serious about loving our neighbors, if we got serious about loving the 8 neighbors who live around us, those 8 people, 1 Christian with 8 neighbors who live around them, the entire cities of Fresno and Clovis are evangelized tomorrow, are served tomorrow, practical needs addressed tomorrow.
Yeah.
The reality is that those 100,000 Christians, very few of them truly love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and likewise with the same intensity love their neighbors. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, you're right. And it's funny, when you said that stat, it made me think of another one where if we all discipled 1 person a year and we multiplied over, a course of many years, I think it's something like 35 years. If it started with you and me and then it split, so that went from 2 to 4, then to 8, then to 16, then over 35 years, I think that would reach about 4 billion. And so the whole world would be saved.
Oh my gosh. Well, the reality is that we just, what do? We look at issues, we look at problems, and we don't see the potential for the very people who live right around us.
Right.
Can I tell you a quick story?
Yeah.
Can I tell you a story?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
My next door neighbor is the hardest worker in Fresno. I truly believe this. He's a machine worker, works as a machinist all day long. And then in the evenings, he grabs scrap metal all across the city. Okay. Well, for months when I first moved into my neighborhood, he'd see me in the front yard, and all I would do is just wave. Hey, Marshall. Hey, that's all I would do. He kind of, give me the stink eye and just kind of keep driving with his old beat up Chevy truck full of scrap metal. Well, after months of doing this, waving to him, finally one day he drives down the street and stops his car right in front of my house, but he keeps the engine running. He rolls down the driver's side window and yells out, "Hey, Joe, come over here. I want to talk to you." So I was like, whoa, like Marshall's never wanted to talk to me before. Like, this is amazing. So I ran over to the car and I was like, hey, trying to act cool. Hey, what's going on, Marshall? How's it going?
Don't want to mess this up.
Full of scrap. Yeah, right. And he's like, hey, Joe, he's like, I got to ask you. He's like, why do you always wave at me when I drive through the neighborhood? And I was like, I didn't know what to say because I was caught off guard. I was like, well, I just, I love my neighbors and I'm trying to love my neighborhood. And I think that's a good thing to do. He's like, what? And I was like, he's like, yeah. And I was like, this is what I think God would do. I think he'd wave at every neighbor. And he would just like love his neighborhood. If God moved into a neighborhood, that's just what he would do. He said, God? He said, what? Like kind of like a church thing? Now, of course, he began to say that he didn't ever having never gone to a church nor knew anything about a church. And he said, so you part of church? I said, well, we actually are. We're pastors of a church called Neighborhood Church right here in this neighborhood. And he's a neighborhood church, very like, what is this suspiciously? Right. What is this church?
Yeah.
And then he said, what kind of church is this?
Oh, interesting.
And I didn't know what to say. I was like so confused. It was like caught off guard. So I said the first thing that came to my mind. It's kind of a church for people who don't really like church.
Okay, yeah.
And then his hands gripped the steering wheel, turning white. His eyes filled up with tears. And he said, do you mean a church for people like me?
Oh, wow.
And it was like, yeah, Marshall. Yes, a church for us, for you and for me, and for many more.
Wow.
Something happens when we just wave. Something happens when we just decide to make place our priority. Kingdom things happen. And so the passion for loving your neighbor is filled with possibilities when we decide to participate in what Jesus asks us all to do, which is to simply love the people we live around.
Yeah, and that's so easy to do, right? We just waving just breaks down so many barriers throughout your neighborhood, and that's a fantastic story about that. No one is ever gonna talk to their spouse after they've driven by you and say that neighbor waved at me again. They're gonna say, do you know that guy? He kind of gave me a dirty look when he was mowing his lawn, but it was maybe just a
Right.
stare, right? But if you actually wave while you're mowing the lawn, that's way more friendly and that's way more inviting, and it could lead to opportunities like you just shared, and that's amazing.
It just strikes me that the name of your podcast is For Fresno, right? And I think most of our neighbors really, really, it's like, what are Christians about? They're about kind of anti-abortion stuff. They're about kind of anti-gay stuff. They're about kind of the things that we're against, right?
Yeah.
But what loving your neighbors does is it reprioritizes for us and for our neighbors what we really value. We value loving. We value caring for people. We value meeting people's practical needs. We value being present to the people who live around us. We value making the neighborhood a better place for everybody to live. We value the priorities of the kingdom itself. And it seems to me that loving your neighbors is the best way to tell your neighbors about what you're for.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you have a lot more in common that way too, because Christians, non-Christians, people are for education. They're for medicine and hospitals. They're for, living in with energy and hot water and making sure that our communities are well and running and people have opportunities. And, that brings people together when they have that common ground. What are we all for? And Christians need, I think, a lesson on focusing on that for sure. So I wanted to jump in and say, what are you for, Joe? What are you for? We talked about your nonprofits, or your nonprofit and your for-profit and your church, and what are you for?
Well, the reality is that I could spend the rest of my life looking into the Jackson neighborhood and identify problems. I could tell you about low income, average income of $26,000 a year. I could tell you that 71% of our neighbors at one point didn't have a high school education. I can tell you high crime rates, low income, about high teen pregnancy, so on and so forth. And the reality is I could spend the rest of my life complaining about everything that's wrong. And I'd be breathing into the wind. Mm-hmm. Because the world is the world, and pain is pain, sin is sin, and hardships are hard. Or I could spend the rest of my life seeing what's in my neighborhood that's good. In other words, if I were hovering over my neighborhood and everything were dark, and somehow, some way in my mind's eye, I were able to see that on the corner of Kirkhoff and 3rd, there was a little light. And it was a family that loved their neighborhood. And then maybe I'd go down to Huntington and 7th, and I'd see another light pop, and another light on Platt and 4th, and then another light on Balch and 8th. And all of a sudden, in my mind's eye, I would see these little lights all over the neighborhood. These lights represent people who have skills and gifts and qualities that bring goodness and wholeness, that bring the values of the kingdom into the place called Jackson. And somehow my job as a resident in Jackson is to simply bring all those lights together to shine in the same direction. After all, that's exactly what a lighthouse is. A lamp is one light trying to do 360 degrees of everything for everybody. I don't want to be a light. I want to be part of a lighthouse. Where you have a bunch of different lights all shining together in the same direction, organized together for the well-being of place. That's what we're about. And so we say, look, how do we do it? We have a church called Neighborhood Church. We do it through our nonprofit, the Jackson CDC. We do it through our small business, trying to employ people with barriers to employment. We try to do these things and many more things like that to simply organize light in a way that makes a lasting difference for people in place. That's really our obsession.
That's a great visual that I've never really thought through as much as you just shared it right there, because we always are taught in church or even growing up in Sunday school, for those who went, that we need to be a light on a hill kind of conversation, but to be organized light, that is a different visual that I think is very important for people to understand, and not only for organized light, because we are individuals, as the light on the hill, but there are many lights that need to be together to all shine the direction, and it gets people involved, it gets people connected.
Totally.
That visual, and the fact that the more light you have in the right direction or in the same direction, the brighter, right? The more you're.
Well, and
going to
here's
impact.
the thing. the people who are light would surprise you. I think a lot of times what we find in our neighborhood is that when you decide that the priorities of the kingdom are your kind of essential mandate, you'll work with anybody of goodwill. You'll go, look, you may not be a Christian yet, but you're showing signs of the kingdom, like there's an openness to the things of God, and you and I'll work with you. It means that denominational ridiculousness doesn't become the priority. It means that theological differences don't become the priority. It means that ethnic differences don't become the priority. If we decide that the well-being of people in place is our priority, we have common ground. And so, as some like to say, people of good faith, that's me, need people to work with people of goodwill. And people of goodwill need to work with people of good faith if we're going to do a job that lasts forever. If we're going to make a difference in a way that lasts forever, we need to be willing to work with each other.
I mean, how did you find yourself in the Jackson neighborhood? Because I know, we're in great situations in ministry where we got big mega churches, we got all the resources that we have, but I think you chose a different path, and I want to hear more about that.
Here's the craziest thing in the world. So not too long ago, I was living in one of the wealthiest cities in Canada, a place called Vancouver, British Columbia. By all standards in travel magazines, it's number 1, 2, or 3 of the best cities in the world. And if you take a look at Vancouver, British Columbia, you'll see a skyline that's an amazing cityscape, buffeted up against the North Shore Mountains, typically filled with snow and ripe for adventure. It's a place where you could surf in the afternoon and then ski in the evening and then go back home and drink your wine. That's not so super bad. And I didn't just live anywhere in Vancouver. I lived a half a block from the beach and 20 minutes from a ski hill in one of the nicest cities in the world. Not so bad.
Nope.
But let me tell you, I wouldn't trade any of that for the things that we see constantly in the context of Jackson. But the story about how we got there is a long one. Here's the short version. The short version is, while living a half a block from the beach and 20 minutes from a ski hill, I remembered the fact that God continues to prioritize the most vulnerable among us. Mm-hmm. And you got to ask the question, if God showed up in your city, where would he live? I mean, if he had to lay his bed somewhere, where would he go? And I'm convinced, as I read all 4 stories about Jesus in the New Testament, and then read the entirety of Scripture, starting in the Garden of Genesis to the city of Revelation, if you really saturate yourself in the text, you'll hear over and over again God prioritizing the poor, God prioritizing the city, God investing in difficult places. In fact, Jesus models this himself. So as I continue to saturate myself in the Word of God, I see this priority towards the most vulnerable places. And I thought to myself, the Jackson neighborhood in Fresno, California, it was one of those vulnerable places. It's one of 22 neighborhoods in Fresno that are high crime, low income, high concentrated poverty. Wow. It's a neighborhood that's been devastated by all sorts of real issues that we actually can solve together and the gospel can take a hold of. And so to me, it's this reprioritization about what's important to God that brought me to Jackson. And that's not for everybody. We don't make any qualms about the fact that not everybody needs to move to Jackson. In fact, not everybody is being called to move to Jackson. That's why he called me and a handful of other families to move intentionally there. But I'm convinced that wherever we live or wherever we decide to live, we've been strategically placed by God to love our neighbors there. And so my story brought me to Jackson.
Yeah. And just for our listeners out there, you originally grew up in Fresno, right? So when you're saying you moved from Vancouver, it's not like you just picked a spot on a map. You had some awareness of the city that you were born in.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I grew up in a place called the Lowell neighborhood. The Lowell neighborhood at the time that I grew up there was the highest crime, lowest income neighborhood in the city. And families, Christian families, moved on nearly every block of the neighborhood together to work on loving their neighbors. That's the soil that I was deeply saturated in. And then years later, moved to Vancouver, British Columbia. And that was a real shift into wealth and learning how to love my neighbors, especially neighbors who had everything like Ferraris and owned mansions, that kind of thing. And then I had to figure out how to transplant all of what I knew growing up into the context of Jackson with rich and poor together.
Yeah. Wow. That's phenomenal. Phenomenal story. I mean, yeah, if any of you listeners out there to get to hear Joe's testimony or Joe's story in a longer format, I urge you to stay seated and listen, because God's power moves through all of us, and he's one example of being obedient, which is amazing. So Joe, we're talking about the different parts of the city. There's, especially in this city even too, there's poor and rich and a ton of different cultures that make up this wonderful melting pot of Fresno. What do you think we can do to help unite the city?
Well, I think it's taking a different perspective. Fresno has a narrative of self-loathing, don't we? We have this kind of picture of ourselves, which we've heard ourselves be the butt of every joke. We've seen the memes which speak negatively about our place, and in some ways, we've internalized those memes. I think as Fresnans, we are good at internalizing our pain, and we also live in a painful place, right? We're the fifth largest city in California, but we have some of the highest concentrated poverty there is. We have real issues. It developed systemically and politically and so on and so forth that took their toll. And yet, we could spend the rest of our lives breathing into the wind about every problem. And so what unites us better than saying, okay, what if it's not the problems which unite us? In fact, the problems exacerbate our division. What if we took a different approach? What if we took an asset-based approach? That is to say, what if we saw what was good in our city and amplified that? What if we saw what was positive? What we saw what was kingdom and amplified that? And so over the years, the things that seem to unite the body of Christ in Fresno seem to be those things. Here's an example. The Well Community Church in Fresno every year does an event called Serve Fresno. They cancel their services and send their people into the city to make a difference in practical ways. Wow. It's a feature. It's something that blesses countless nonprofits and churches across the city as volunteers saturate neighborhoods and do work projects and service projects. These are the kind of things that unite people towards what is good because they feel like they can do good also. In fact, just this weekend, we're having about 300 volunteers in the context of the Jackson neighborhood cleaning about a square 4 blocks, every sidewalk, every alley, every side street. We'll be picking up trash and removing. Just 2 weeks ago, we removed 1,900 trash from 2 alleyways in Jackson. These are tangible things that unite neighbors for the common good. And I think that's really our approach for people that have a narrative of self-loathing that constantly on Fresno to talk about the tale of two cities. There's the North Fresno, there's South Fresno. If they just cared about us in South Fresno, we got to quit that. We got to quit that.
There is that.
We got to say there's pain everywhere. There's pain everywhere, and we could spend the rest of our lives breathing into the wind about how bad things are, or we could unite around what's good.
Right.
And so I'd say for all of your listeners, look for the good and talk about it.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I agree. I totally agree. And I think that's part of the heart of where I hope this idea for Fresno can go, just from my perspective. Again, people know what the church is against, or they think they know what the church is against, and they can list all these different things. And even Christianity revolves around do's and don'ts for a lot of people, the legalism of it. And if we just focus on what we can do for good, because I think as much as we're flawed and sinful human beings, we yearn to do good. We yearn to connect with our Creator, and we yearn to emulate Him. We were created in His image, and so we want to do good things. And so, as people strive to better humanity, let's do that together and focus on those good things. I think that's a great reminder for all of us. So
from a practical perspective, that means that all of our listeners, from a practical perspective, it would be to say, I live where I live on purpose. I live where I live, strategically placed by God to love my neighbors. And my first job as a neighbor, living strategically placed by God to live exactly where I live, is to look for what's good and build on that. So that might mean that you have a neighbor who loves mowing their lawn. They keep a tidy home. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. And so maybe that becomes the on-ramp for more good together, or it's a neighbor that seems to be kind of a social person. They kind of seem to be, kind of an extrovert type. They like chatting and they like chatting. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. It's to say, look for the good and build on that. That's our mandate as people who love our neighbors and who act like we love our neighbors and are for Fresno.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I think that takes a lot of talent. And not talent, but skill, a developing skill to recognize, because you're right, as people, not only in Fresno, but people in general, we have a kind of a self-loathing thing that comes in and out of our lives, and to be able to just sit back and not have to drive in our cars and close the garage door and go inside our house, but to actually take a look outside and see what the good is happening around our neighborhood, even if we live in neighborhoods that aren't so good on the face of it, but try to find the good in people and things that are happening around our communities. That takes some skill.
The craziest thing about it is intuitively we know how to do this. I mean, any parent,
right.
if they only ever saw the flaws in children, would hate their children. Right? So we know how to do this. We know how to look for, oh, little Johnny, I just love the way little Johnny, he's so athletic. Oh, little
right.
Sally, she's so good. It's like we know how to do this, but for some reason we don't do it when it comes to the places we live in.
Yeah.
Oh, my neighborhood, the sidewalks aren't big enough. Oh, there's too many people beating down the street. Oh, my neighbors don't even talk to each other. It's kind of an isolated place. Right?
Yeah.
We kind of switch roles because our neighborhood isn't like a child to us. And so it's reframing how we see our place. I'm strategically placed by God to live exactly where I live on purpose.
Yeah.
And if that's true, then I would treat this place the same way I would treat a person. I would look for what's good and build on it.
Yep. That's a good reminder for me too. I love it. That's great. So, Joe, we've been talking a lot about what you do, and I just for the listeners out there is so much to these levels of how he's involved in the Jackson neighborhood. But while we're just briefly talking about it and trying to encourage and inspire a lot of people out there to impact their community, what are some things that we can help you do, Pastor Joe, or how can we get involved in any way? I mean, I know you're pretty specific to your neighborhood, obviously, and we are not. But is there things that we can partner with you on? Is there? I'm not sure, but how can we help each other?
Oh, I so appreciate that question. I am a firm believer that many hands make work, and we have some heavy work in the Jackson neighborhood. There are real things related to education and crime and homelessness and housing and income, so on and so forth, that are real issues. The reality is that there are enough hands in our city to actually make a difference. And so here are 3 things that anybody listening today, if they would like to participate in the Jackson neighborhood, can do. Number 1, if you're a person who has skills related to woodworking or welding, get in touch with me. We want to use your skills to teach students in the Jackson neighborhood these skills. We want more of our students knowing how to do woodworking, more of our students knowing how to do welding, because we believe that job transferable skills, the development of skills alongside of a loving relationship can transform a kid's life forever. And so would you be willing to use your assets in the context of our place? Number 1. Number 2, we have real beautification issues related to the Jackson neighborhood. We have light poles and lamp poles, which are dilapidated. We have alleyways, which are dirty. We have streets that need attention. And if you would like to bring service projects or teams into the context of our place, we will put you to work. Number 2. Number 3, we have all sorts of programming happening during the year that reaches our neighbors' practical needs. One of those, though, I'd like to explain to you, which is called our Relief Fund. COVID has been devastating, especially for our most vulnerable. It's been okay for me as a middle-class person. I've been able to shelter in place at home and work from home. I mean, it's been difficult, obviously, very hard and emotionally taxing. But for many of our residents who didn't benefit from things like stimulus packages, who were called into work without the same health precautions that they will have in my work. Some of these issues are very, very exacerbated for some of our migrant farm workers or undocumented or just neighbors who are working low-income jobs who've been cut with hours. We have something called a relief fund. We're literally paying people's bills. If you have water bills that are mounting up, if you have rent bills that are mounting up, if you have electricity bills that are mounting up, you can apply through our grant in the neighborhood to get your stuff paid for. If you'd like to contribute to that account that literally pays people practical needs, we would like to sign you up to support a family who is struggling to pay their bills. Contribute to the relief fund. That's the 3rd thing that you can do. Those are all great ways to make many hands make light work, and we would love to get you started.
Yeah, that's great. And so just to recap quickly too, the number 1 was woodworking or welding skills, because that's part of your neighborhood jobs, I believe, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, it's part of our business. Yeah.
Yeah, and out of that comes you guys build things like libraries and stuff that actually help the community.
Oh, yeah.
Like these people who are learning these skills are getting an immediate job experience and learn how to make money well, and I think that's amazing. That's just really great.
Yeah.
And then the beautification. We all want to have a great neighborhood to live in, and if we can't see at night because it's dark in our neighborhood, or you talked about the lampposts, I think that's very important too. I love that. And then the third thing with the relief fund, I mean that's an obvious, amazing thing. Supporting people with water and power and helping pay the bills. That's
totally.
Yeah, that's great. So. Joe, I am so thankful that we had this conversation. I know I talked to you a lot, but just in this context, you learn some, you're encouraged. I'm just so thankful that you're able to come and be the first guest as the For Fresno podcast show. And
love it.
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you. And I know when we record this, you're going to be going on some sabbatical. So enjoy your rest.
Yeah.
It's well deserved.
I appreciate that.
Cool. Thank you. Well, I was inspired from that conversation. I didn't know exactly what he was going to share throughout, and some of those stories just really hit me. I don't know if they hit you, but I want to thank you, first of all, for listening to our first podcast for Fresno. I really appreciate the support. Also, I want to thank Pastor Joe White again from Neighborhood Church in the Jackson neighborhood again for being our first guest. That's awesome. Just really, really proud of him and the work he's doing out there. In fact, if you want to help him, some of the things he's listed, whether it's woodworking, welding, beautification, or be a part of the relief fund and participate in that, you can email him at joe@neighborhoodchurchfresno.com. That's joe@neighborhoodchurchfresno.com. And we'd love for you to help that community. Also, if you go to forfresno.com and you find this episode where we talk to Pastor Joe, you can also send him a digital thank you. Often these ministry leaders and people who you might be talking to are just working and exhausted, and a lot of their work goes overlooked or maybe even underappreciated. And so if something inspired you or energized you in such a way where you can log onto our website, find this, and you can send a digital thank you to Joe, and we'll make sure that he gets it. All right. Thank you for listening to our first podcast for Fresno. Visit our site, forfresno.com. We'll see you in the next podcast.